So, when we're talking about fiction, canon is the material accepted as officially part of the story in the fictional universe of that story. It is often contrasted with, or used as the basis for, works of fanfiction. In other words, canon refers to the facts of a story as they are presented to the audience. It is quite literally what has happened and is what is currently happening in a fictional universe as far as the creators of said universe see it. Canon is what you and I, as members of the audience, consume and interpret based on our own ideas and experiences. We adopt the canon details into our minds through whichever medium we consume them through, be it film, TV, video games, books, or many more. In most cases, we take it a step further and develop our own personal thoughts and ideas regarding the story that are derived from the canon details, but likely don't technically take place within the actual work itself. We come up with our own personal canon for the work, in a way. A headcanon, if you will. Headcanon, as defined by fan lore, is a fan's personal, idiosyncratic interpretation of canon, such as habits of a character, the backstory of a character, or the nature of relationships between characters. The term comes from the fact that it is the canon that exists in a fan's head. This can be affected by both professional transformative works, such as art, movies, and audiobooks, and by fan works, such as fan art, fanfiction, cosplay, manips, vids, and podfic. Storytelling and world building are arduous tasks on their own for creatives, and become infinitely more difficult when you add the caveat of having to do so for an audience. And they become nigh impossibly more difficult when you have to do so for an audience for money. So, teams of creatives, never really having unlimited resources at their disposal to tell their story, have to make the tough decision of picking and choosing what to put out to the audience to best communicate their ideas. Essentially, this means that while the details that are put out to the audience are often enough to create a well-defined and realized canon, there's pretty much always going to be some things left up to our audience interpretation. Spaces within the canon where we can fill in the blanks if we so choose. And if a bunch of members of a work's audience choose to fill in the blanks in canon in the same or at least a similar way, then we have what we call fanon. Headcanon may represent a teasing of subtext present in the canon, or it may directly contradict canon. If other fans share this interpretation, it may become fanon. For our purposes here today, we're going to look at two definitions of the word fanon from Urban Dictionary. To begin, we define fanon as being ideas or events that are accepted by most fans but were not actually in the original story / book / show, etc. It also defines it as the canon of fandom. Fanon is the collection of concepts and ideas that were normally used in most fanfiction but don't really exist in the real story's canon. So basically, if you put your story out there for an audience to consume and interpret, you've got a canon, and you also open yourself up to a fanon developing. Some people aren't really keen on the whole fanon, headcanon, fandom, and transformative works culture in general, and if you're one of those people, then thank you for stopping by, and I certainly welcome you to stay if you think that you'll be interested, but this might not be the channel for you. Because I'm pretty firm in my belief that fanon and fandom are net positive things at the end of the day. While it's certainly important to recognize that there's a difference between canon and fanon, and that creatives are absolutely entitled to tell the story that they want to tell, independent of what the public thinks, I generally believe that having fans be so willing to engage thoughtfully with your work to the point that fanon develops is an excellent sign that your story is touching a lot of people and connecting with them in a way that one should be proud of. And engaging with fandom and fanon can sometimes shed light on an interpretation of your work that you may have never considered based on your own experiences, and you may end up loving it. Of course, with all things that have the public and potentially money involved, it can get contentious and it can get ugly. After all, quite a lot of fanon is the direct result of fans not liking something that the creators did and coming up with their own alternatives to it, to either undo it or explain it away. But even this discourse can be enlightening for those who take the time to examine it. and it can be valuable for up-and-coming creatives to themselves to pay attention to the relationship between canon and fanon in media. Now, with all that groundwork laid out, let's get on to what we're doing today, my friends. Good morning, good evening, good night, whatever it is for you, my friends. I'm Don, your friendly neighborhood disaster that thinks way too much over tiny details and the bringer of unsolicited opinions and analysis. Today we'll be plucking a character from some form of media and examining their canon presentation as given by the creators and their Fanon interpretation as shared by the fandom. I'll be doing my best to explain to you guys what I feel is the most objective version of this character based on what's been shown in the canon, as well as what I've gathered by combing through the fandom to be the most generally accepted fan interpretation of the character. We'll then compare and contrast them, as well as try and pinpoint the canon details that led to the fanon expansion. We'll see if the canon details even really support the fanon interpretation, or if the fanon has really taken on a life of its own. Some disclaimers: this is purely for fun and to shed a light on some details that may or may not have gone unnoticed. I will give my own general opinions towards the end, and I, like everyone, do have my own personal biases, but I feel it's important to note that I'm not trying to say that the fanon is objectively better than the canon, nor am I trying to discourage people from coming up with headcanons and wondering with them. This is quite literally just an analysis of canon and a potential resource for those who don't quite get the fanon to hopefully understand the fandom a bit better. There will likely be spoilers for the work in question. For discerning the closest thing to an intended canon presentation of the character, I will be looking through the media in question. And I will be taking any supplemental materials or added creator commentary into account. For the fanon, I will be looking through fan fiction, fan art, fan comics, pretty much any form of transformative fiction, as well as blogs, social media threads, as well as videos from prominent members of the fandom, and the comment sections of those aforementioned videos. Let it be known that while I'm treating this as a research assignment of sorts, your interpretation of details may still vary wildly from mine based on your experiences. And that's okay. Hopefully you'll still be able to find some enjoyment or interest from this. Anyways, with all of that preamble out of the way, for today's characters, we have to take a trip to the world of Remnant, the setting of the original web animation series, RWBY. An extremely brief overview, if you're unfamiliar with it. RWBY is an American anime-inspired animated web series that premiered in July of 2013 on Rooster Teeth's website. It comes from the brain of the late Monty Oum, who tragically passed away suddenly from a severe allergic reaction during a routine medical procedure on February 1st of 2015, partway through the development of the show's third volume. His colleagues at Rooster Teeth opted to continue production on the show in honor of his memory, and at the time of this recording, RWBY has 7 complete volumes, multiple expansions into other mediums, many forms of merch, a dedicated and passionate fandom, with its 8th volume on the way very quickly. The guy we're plucking from the exhaustingly expansive dossier of named characters in the show is one Oscar Pine, but you clicked on the video, so you knew that already. Introduced in the first episode of the show's 4th volume, Oscar is a farmhand that finds himself in the position of being the next incarnation of Ozma, an ancient warrior locked in opposition to RWBY's big bad, Salem. Now, RWBY has a crap ton of supplemental material to go along with the main show, but I've stuck only to the main show, World of Remnant episodes, read through the team's commentary, and watched the relevant RWBY Rewind episodes for the purpose of determining Oscar's canon presentation. It's really not that difficult on the surface. He doesn't have too much screen time comparatively to the other members of the main cast, but his character has one very interesting complication and is integral to the overall plot of RWBY. To get a feel of how the fandom views him, I've skimmed through the entire Oscar Pine tag on AO3 while filtering out any explicit fics or fics that feature him as the other half of a pairing. I've gone through several pages of the Oscar Pine tag on Tumblr, looked through fan art, found a few fan-made videos, and watched 4 pretty prominent fixtures in the RWBY fandom's videos that speak about him, and read through a good portion of their comment sections. I've also gone through the comment sections on the episodes which he appears on Rooster Teeth's site. To determine what I think the show may be trying to hint at regarding his complication, I've rewatched every RWBY episode that features Ozpin on his own, even though all of these predate Oscar's introduction in the show. I don't have a very clear answer for this, but it has left me with an interesting perspective on viewing fan discourse about this complication. It's important to note that Oscar Pine's canon is not complete yet. RWBY is still ongoing, and he is still a regular character. Any hypotheses I present regarding his canon presentation will most certainly be subject to change and not have the full picture. Seeing as though at the time of this recording, there have been 7 volumes of RWBY so far, with an 8th on the way very quickly. This video may or may not age well, but that's what updates and follow-ups are for. So let's start with the basic facts. Oscar Pine is a cute little farmhand that's 14 years old at the time of his introduction. Now, RWBY's timeline is a little wonky and hard to follow at times, but according to some behind-the-scenes commentary, there has been enough of a time lapse between Volume 4 and Volume 7 that he's now 15. He has an aunt whom he lived with prior to getting involved with the plot, and no other confirmed family. He's shy, a bit on the quiet side, but does in fact seem to enjoy the company of others. The way he gets involved in the main plot of RWBY goes as such. One day, he wakes up and starts hearing a voice in his head. This is the voice of Ozpin, the headmaster of Beacon Academy and previous incarnation of the old hero Ozma. Once again, the big good opposed to the big bad. Oscar's notably confused and stressed out over this knowledge, but somehow by the end of Volume 4, Ozpin manages to convince him to seek out Bronwyn. It's important to note that the process by which Ozpin convinces him takes place mainly off-screen, but there does seem to be the usual anime protag yearning for more aspect to Oscar's character that Ozpin is able to appeal to. He has no advanced combat training to speak of, and had to be taught how to use his aura by other members of the cast during Volume 5. Because Ozpin has taken up residence in his mind, though, Oscar has the edge of eventually inheriting Ozpin's martial prowess and memories and whatnot, so he improves exponentially, to the point where he can at the very least hold his own against another headmaster at the end of Volume 5. A fact to note at this point in the timeline is that Oscar also finds out the hard way that Ozpin can assume direct control over his body if he wants to. There is no on-screen fallout from Oscar learning this, but it's important to note. He does seem to suffer from a level of anxiety and fear over what he's gotten himself into, but this also quickly abates by the end of Volume 5, where he's willing to face down an enemy that's clearly out of his skill level, as well as lecture the baddies on morality and responsibility and the like. Oscar and Ozpin's complex situation comes to a boiling point in Volume 6, where it's revealed that Ozpin hasn't been all the way honest with the main cast regarding the big bad. This time, Oscar is the one who attempts to assume control from Ozpin by force, and while it seems to cause him visceral, mental, and physical distress, and he's barely able to do so long enough to help the party learn how to use the Relic of Knowledge, which is how they learn what Ozpin has been hiding from them. It's here that we get a hint of the fallout that would have also made sense at the beginning of Volume 5, when Oscar point-blank says that he hates this, likely referring to being connected to Ozpin, given that he admits his anxieties over being just another one of his lives not too long after. Oh, and Ozpin locks himself away from Oscar, only popping back in to help him crash land a plane at the end of the volume? Yeah, that happens. This also affects Oscar's relationships with the other characters, whom up to this point we can assume regarded Oscar fondly, albeit maybe a bit perturbed by the idea of Ozpin being in his head. The rest of the team, special mention going to Crow, seems to distance themselves from Oscar after this, or at least they don't have much on-screen dialogue with him for a good portion of the volume. The exceptions to this are RWBY and Maria. After dealing with the horror movie plot, though, it can be inferred that the team warms up to Oscar again pretty quickly, as by the time they reach their destination, everyone's on their cute boy Oz agenda again. At least until Jean, Ren, and Nora find out the same things that Team RWBY found out. Then we get another scene in which someone has trouble keeping their hands to themselves, and Oscar runs off to have an existential crisis, as referred to in the Volume 6 commentary, off-screen, and returns with new threads and a new positive outlook on life. It's pretty much confirmed here that Oscar believes that he'll lose himself throughout this process of adopting Ozpin's mission, but he's determined to do his best with the time that he has left. Volume 7 is really just a lot of Oscar as a character finding more of his footing with the group. At times it seems like he's lonely, and he does not seem to be too terribly comfortable around Ironwood, but he wants to extend his trust and has some pretty insightful commentary on the nature of fear and trust in doing what's right. It's also pretty important to note that at some points he starts to adopt more of Ospen's mannerisms and speech patterns. Oscar is a bit more assertive this go around, and we end the volume with Ospen popping back up, this time seemingly here to stay, and Oscar wanting to know what he needs to do to save the people of the place they're in, because holy damn did shit hit the fan this volume. Essentially, Oscar Pine, as he appears in canon, is your pseudo-typical shonen male protagonist, coming from small means and having a desire for something more from life, with some wild and intense extra facet to his character that sets him apart from everyone else. He's quiet and shy, but doesn't have a problem reaching out to the people he considers friends, and will make jokes with those he's close with. He's principled, likely subscribes heavily to the idea of taking responsibility for one's own actions, and values trust. He's had some anxiety and angst over essentially just being the next Ozma, but at some point just kind of accepts that he's going to be another incarnation and rolls with it. Let's talk Fanon now. The first thing I found interesting was just how many members of the RWBY fandom seem to think that he's still canonically 14. I understand this confusion surrounding this, though. You have to know what the team says and the crew commentaries to really understand just how long the time skips between volumes and within volumes are. And even then, they speak about Ruby's age specifically, saying that she's 16 at the start of Volume 5 and 17 at the start of Volume 6. So there's a little bit of an extra step in deducing that Oscar's age to year, even if it is a really tiny step. Him having a canon birth date would probably help. Beyond that, the biggest thing that Fanon intends to explore as far as Oscar Pine's character goes are his relationship with other characters, and his emotion and thoughts regarding his status as an Ozma incarnation. In fanfiction, Oscar tends to retain his shy boy nature as characterized on the show, but writers tend to add a snarky sense of humor and on a general, fun-loving nature that are both vaguely hinted at the show, but aren't really explored. There's a lot of touch-starved and affection-starved fics about him too. Fans tend to like to come up with reasons why he lives with his aunt and not his parents, the most common reason having something to do with the Grimm. Fanon Oscar tends to have this characterization that he wants to be loved and fit in. It's really quite wholesome. The fandom mostly explores his relationship with Team Juniper and Ospen. Fics where the focus is on Jean, Ren, and Nora frequently feature Oscar as a sort of little brother figure to the three, and go into the latent feelings of loss the three have over Pyrrha, and how that makes them hyperfixated on keeping Oscar safe. There's even a whole series of fics in which Pyrrha is still alive and Team Juniper essentially adopts Oscar and treats him like their literal child. There's a good basis for this in the show, at least in Volume 7. Beforehand, Nora very obviously enjoys Oscar quite a bit, and Jean gets notably emotional over the thought of hurting him at the end of Volume 6, but the real team dynamics between the four of them only really takes the spotlight at points during Volume 7. There is a fair amount of trend towards infantilizing Oscar in the fandom, from what I can tell. The reasons for this are quite obvious. I mean, look at the kid. He is indeed baby. But it's just fascinating to see, considering Oscar in show comes off as extremely mature for his age, and most instances of any overtly childlike innocence or tendencies come from him being mostly ignorant to the world of Huntsman. Fics and headcanons that focus on Oscar and Ospen's relationships are fascinating to me, as they seem to take on a very father-son vibe and are equal in emotional levels to the ones that feature Oscar with friends. This is interesting, because while in the canon storyline, Oscar and Ospen certainly seem to have an amicable relationship for a short period of time, and it can definitely be read as a mentor-esque relationship. It's pretty clear that while Ospen definitely holds some level of affection and responsibility for Oscar, Oscar never really warms up to Ospen in the same way. He certainly appreciates Ospen and trusts him easily enough, but Oscar also questions Ospen frequently, is overall indifferent to his presence most of the time, and outright seems to not like him very much after the whole reveal in Volume 6, though he seems willing to work on that at the end of Volume 7 at least, after they deal with the dumpster fire of unfortunate events. Anyways, it doesn't surprise me that the fandom wants these two to be in a familial manner with one another. That's a common Fanon response to a mentorship relationship in media, and there's certainly precedent for it here, but it's just interesting to note. Speaking of mentorship, there's also a handful of works and posts that focus on sliding Crow into that slot, specifically in Volume 6 after Oz yeets himself out. These also sometimes address this scene and attempt to bring to it a resolution that never happens on screen in the show. Now, while the overwhelming majority of fan works are focused on expanding and exploring his relationship with other characters, the overwhelming want from the fandom as far as Oscar goes seems to be wanting more screen time and development in the show from him. Starting from his first conversation with Crow, the fandom seems to want to know what it is Oscar does and goes through off-screen that lead to such large jumps in his character development. Especially in Volume 6, where he has an existential crisis off-screen and comes back good as new with no rhyme or reason other than, and I quote, "I did some thinking," end quote. The fandom has a lot of ideas surrounding this moment, most focusing on Oscar being angry and sad over his situation and admitting that he thinks it's unfair. There are quite a few works exploring how Oscar may feel insecure about his own identity, and how he may be unsure as to if his thoughts are even his own. Some works in headcanon even try to pinpoint the moment in the story where Oscar begins to start having distaste for his situation with Ospen, as by the time of the big reveal at the beginning of Volume 6, it can be kind of inferred that Oscar's had some unhappy feelings about it for a bit of time by then. There's a lot of nuance found in the fandom regarding these specific moments, and pretty much any fanon could fit within the confines of canon and not change anything. Though I will say that the fandom tends to lean towards Oscar's acceptance of his situation being a lot more optimistic than it actually is in the show. Most fanon has Oscar come to the realization that he is in fact his own person, separated from Ospen and valuable in his own way, and he goes on thinking that as long as he remembers that, and has the rest of the team with him, everything will be okay. In the show proper, even though the scene is framed very triumphantly and happy, Oscar pretty much point-blank admits to accepting the fact that he's going to be just another one of Ozma's lives, and his determination comes from wanting to do the most with the time that he has left. It is significantly less optimistic on paper, and makes it seem like Oscar has already accepted his loss of self and is okay with that. There is quite a bit of disagreement amongst the fandom as to whether or not Oscar is going to remain Oscar by the time his and Ospen's souls unite fully. According to the crew's commentary, Oscar will indeed go on to become the dominant personality, but what this means for his characterization as far as the show goes is still very unclear. Much of the fandom is attached to the idea that Oscar's base personality is going to eventually shine through with just a little added wisdom and knowledge, while a relatively equal amount of fans seem to believe that Oscar will adopt more and more of Ospen's persona until they're virtually unrecognizable from each other, and that will become the character that we see. Quite frankly, the show's canon is still at a place where this could easily go either way, and this topic really doesn't contribute to a coherent and general fanon, so much as it just contributes to fandom discourse. So for the purposes of this video, I'm just leaving it on that note. Oh yeah, and it's pretty common to see members of the fandom accept the idea that Oscar probably has a crush on RWBY. That's just something I wanted to note, because the canon is ambiguous enough that one could get a crush from Oscar's part, but you could also look at their interactions and call platonic besties, kind of in the way that RWBY and Jean's relationship has developed. There are some very loud critics of this idea, and from what I can tell, they're mostly just an unpleasantly ferocious minority of the fandom, but the basic gist of that discourse is Ospen in Oscar's mind plus potential romantic coding with RWBY equals underage, yikes, dead dove, do not eat shenanigans, which is quite the reach, considering that all considerable quote-unquote shippable moments between the two have taken place when Ospen is notably knocked away and not actively around in Oscar's head. I really don't particularly care to expand more on that, Shipping is a whole other subset of fandom and fanon and would warrant its own video discussing the topic, and has nothing much to add to our purposes here other than acknowledging that quite a bit of the fandom buy into the idea of Oscar crushing on RWBY. I have exactly 2 ships in RWBY that I care anything about, and Rose Garden is most certainly not one of them, but at the end of the day, I'm pretty much always going to follow on the side of ship and let's ship. Anyway, conclusion time. Canon and Fanon Oscar Pine are indeed very similar in a sense that Fanon Oscar Pine is mainly just the canon version, with the fandom seeking to fill in the gaps with his development in the show proper. Unless the fan is going full AU and building a completely different setup for Oscar's character from scratch, the canon events of the story do for the most part support what the fandom has come to associate with Oscar and fan works. The fandom likes to focus in on Oscar's status as the youngest main cast member, play up his innocence and seemingly lack of world experience, while the show lets those aspects of his character fall to the wayside more often than not in favor of showing how mature and wise beyond his years he's coming to be. Parts of the fandom that are sympathetic to Ozpin's story tend to err on the side of Oscar and Oz having a father-son dynamic, where in the show it's more of a mentor/reluctant mentee dynamic. The ones that are unsympathetic to Ozpin sometimes put Crow into the mentor/paternal figure role. Pretty much all common fandom is in agreement that all of the main cast adores Oscar, and will go out of their way to make him feel loved and appreciated. This is supported in show mainly on RWBY, Jean, Nora, and Ren's part, and the fandom goes out of its way to give characterization and context to Oscar settling his off-screen existential crisis, which is simply not present in the canon as of the time of this recording, so that's just fair game. Nothing really comes out of nowhere on the fandom's part unless we start talking about shipping, but as I mentioned earlier, we're not. Canon Oscar seems woefully underutilized on screen given his importance level to the plot, and my best guess for why is that the writers of RWBY constantly have a surplus of ideas and characters that they want to fit on the screen with limited time and resources. To me, it seems like they have milestones for Oscar's character arc, like him deciding to leave home, him developing a better understanding of Ozpin in his head and what it means for him having an existential crisis over it, him getting over said crisis, Ozpin coming back. It's like they know what they have to show from Oscar in order to make his role in the plot make at least the tiniest bit of sense, but the connecting avenues between these moments get kind of lost and fumbled amongst the production schedule, accepting new ideas on the spot, bringing on even more named characters, and retconning things that are too hard to continue with. Fanon attempts to make sense of it all, and the fandom certainly seems to have a fun time doing it, but it's coupled with a faint undercurrent of frustration because honestly, Oscar probably should be used more in canon. But like I said, his canon is not complete yet. This is all done at the time of Volume 7's end and just before Volume 8 begins. I'm looking forward to seeing how both the canon and fanon develop from this point forward, and hopefully you are as well. Anyways, keep writing, keep watching, keep creating, keep theorizing, just do your thing, fandom, and we'll see you next time. And always remember that Ozpin, or no Ozpin, Oscar Pine is a son. That's it.